Without further ado, let me welcome Christiane Kirketerp de Viron, European Commission Head of Cybersecurity and Digital Privacy Policy Unit, and she will have a keynote on EU cybersecurity initiatives. Please welcome. A warm applause. Good one, but I know you can do better than that. Perfect. Now it's much, much better. Good. Christine, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, and also thanks for the warm welcome. I hope I'll give an even bigger applause when I'm done, because I've been given a great task of covering all the cybersecurity initiatives of the EU in half an hour. And as I've heard from many, many people, we're doing quite a lot in this field, for sure. And also sometimes we actually get the question of how does it all fit together, because of course we are building this area incrementally, so one after the other it's coming out, and people sometimes wonder how it all fits together. So I thought, let me go to Latvia today and test out some new ideas on how we actually explain how it all fits together. So I asked the team, before when I was preparing to come here, I asked them, if we were to put everything we do into one picture, what would it look like? And if you go to the next slide on my presentation, you could see the first thing I got from the team, which is basically a very, very busy kitchen. So I think this is a very good illustration of what it looks like in the EU cybersecurity kitchen these days. I would say we're not too many chefs, quite to the contrary. There are many people involved, of course, but we have been extremely busy preparing one dish or one legislation after the other. However, even though a picture might say 1,000 words, we did get onto something which was a bit more specific, which I will show you on the next slide, because we actually put in here an overview of everything that we have been doing within DG Connect on cybersecurity. And everything that sort of also we've been coordinating and cooperating with the others about. So I want to actually, we try to put it around the logic of prevent, detect, respond, deter, so that it can also give you an impression of the fact that we're actually, you know, obviously we've done a lot of work already on the prevent side. This is also where we've classically been working with the NIS2, but you can also see that there are things now being filled out, and we're doing more work also on the other aspects. But I want to start with where I think it all starts, and it's not just because it's also one of the files we're dealing with specifically in my team, but I want to start with the NIS directive. I call it the mother of it all when we talk about cybersecurity. And that was the first thing we proposed back in 2013 as a directive. And back then, it's 10 years ago, we had extensive discussions. Is it really necessary? Why do we need to start building in this area? And I think everyone who sees where we are today, everyone who looks at both the threat environment we're operating in today, but also the geopolitical environment we're operating in today, I think I have not heard anyone say that it was a bad idea that we start putting down some more legally binding risk management measures on our critical infrastructure. So this is, of course, what we did with the first NIS directive, and with NIS2 we're extending this because, and I guess that's also a sign that it was the right decision to start working in this field. So with NIS2 we're extending the scope. We're going from 13 sectors up to 18 sectors who would now be coming under the scope, and we're also streamlining in terms of risk management measures and incident reporting and the sanctions and the penalties for those entities that are in the scope. It means that a lot of new businesses and organizations will come under scope. We're extending, for instance, also to public administration. We're extending to space. And what is also happening, which is certainly also a key factor in extending the scope, is that as soon as you're a medium-sized entity in one of these sectors, you will be in the NIS2 scope, and you will have to carry out the risk management measures and report incidents. We put into place also the structures for more crisis coordination at the European level. So this is under the respond part, where we put in, with NIS2, we put in the EU Cyclone, which is a network of national cybersecurity authorities, which will help us in case there is a major crisis. And in a way, it's also, I would say, something which is a necessary step, because one thing we know about cyber crisis is that it moves extremely fast, and there wouldn't be time, the same way you see, for instance, when we have a health crisis or a financial crisis, there's no time to build the car when it hits, because you have to start driving on day one. So we've been very also active in that field to build the right framework to make sure that the information is shared in Europe where it needs to be shared. The other thing we've been working hard at is on supply chain security. It's a key topic. We've all seen, of course, the amount of incidents we witnessed in the last years. We know that around 2/3 of all incidents that are reported under NIS are actually related to vulnerabilities in the products. And now that with NIS2, we're telling all our critical entities, you have to ensure supply chain security, you have to talk to your vendors, you have to make sure that you get security updates. We also looked at how can we actually facilitate this. And this is where, if you're looking at the prevention side, the Cyber Resilience Act comes into place. Now, the Cyber Resilience Act, it's still a proposal. We're busy negotiating it in Brussels. But we're at the final stages of the negotiations. So we very much hope that we will have something in place, an agreement by the end of this year. And then, of course, there will be a transition period, so to make sure that everyone gets ready for it. The key thing, I think, about the Cyber Resilience Act is that what we're doing with it is we're basically mandating security by design for every product that is placed on the market in the EU, whether it's hardware or software. So that means that if you're a developer, you need to undergo certain requirements that are laid down in the Act to make sure that you've actually done proper security by design. There's also requirements for after you place your product on the market. So you have to basically carry out testing, you have to write patches, you have to push out your patches and so on, and you have to notify authorities when you have an actively exploited vulnerability in your system. So all of this is generally to strengthen the part of the product security in Europe. I think it's also important to say that, you know, the situation we're in now, it's of course not anyone's fault, because in a way the market is such that when you're pushing out digital products, speed is extremely important if you want to get a market share. And therefore what we've seen is that, of course, security is often a little bit of an afterthought. It's not there as an essential part of the development. But with the Cyber Resilience Act, this we are very keen on changing. And here, of course, there are complementarities over to the certification, where the certification schemes were able to say much more specifically for the very high level of security, that to lay down some very specific requirements. We're not the only ones in the world who have discovered that there is a problem on product security. So we're actually also engaging very actively with our international partners, and that's why you will see also above here I put international cooperation, because we have a lot of different tools where we're talking with our international and our like-minded partners. And product security is for sure one of them, where we are now discussing also with our American friends, trying to look at standards and so on, because this will, of course, help implementation for the companies that are active in this field, because normally if you're developing, you're very likely selling on both markets. So our commitment here is really to make sure that we're aligning as much as possible and that we're making it as simple as possible for the companies. And the same thing also goes to, of course, the companies when you have to comply with the requirements in the Cyber Resilience Act. Here we're very focused on small and medium-sized enterprises, because relatively speaking, the burden will be heavier on them. And we're looking at developing various toolings to help with this process. But it is also something I would like to share in this audience that, you know, if you have ideas, if you are working on this and you have specific ideas for, you know, what could I actually need from my situation, we're always very happy to hear and engage with SMEs. I covered a little bit what we have on the prevent side now. I think I will then move on to more looking at for the detection and the response side, and that is, of course, the new Cyber Solidarity Act that we came out with in April. We call it the last piece of the puzzle because, as you can see, when you're looking at what are the different needs in Europe for having in place both policies, regulatory measures, but also support with funding, the Cyber Solidarity Act actually goes in and closes some of and fixes some of the issues that we have still detected. It is a funding tool to a large extent. It works with the Digital Europe program. And what it does, it funds actually across the board different things. So under, for instance, prevention, what we're proposing to set up is this cyber emergency mechanism, we call it, which will allow, it's a way of channeling funding on the basis of risks assessments to carry out pen testing of our critical infrastructure. This is normally a pretty expensive activity, and we believe that it would be useful to have this kind of support instrument available at the European level. Under the detection side, we're proposing to set up a European cyber shield, as we call it. So that is based on cross-border SOC projects. The intention is to make a European infrastructure of SOCs, whereby we can actually use and invest together in having, you know, enhanced data analytics, artificial intelligence, and actually invest in this overall improvement of our CTI and of our detection capacities. And then finally, with the Cyber Solidarity Act, and that's the other leg of our cyber emergency mechanism, we're also proposing to set up the EU Cyber Reserve, which is two things. On the one hand, it supports mutual assistance between member states, because what we also know and what we want to be prepared for is a situation where one incident is simply too big for one country to handle, and it should be possible then to go and ask other member states for support, and if there is a need for any kind of additional support from our side in terms of funding, it would be possible with the cyber emergency mechanism. So that's one part of it, which is this, I would say, member state to member state support. The other part, and this is a clear lesson learned from us from the war in Ukraine, and we've seen how the attacks on the Ukrainian critical infrastructure was handled, the cyber attacks. It is that we need to engage much more with the private sector, and that is extremely important, that the private sector plays an extremely important role when it comes to also incident response and the capacity to deal with large-scale incidents. So that is the reason why we're also foreseeing a program whereby you could work with trusted security service providers, and that they would be able to, in case of a major incident, that as a member state you would be able to ask for this kind of assistance from trusted providers. And in a way that is actually very similar to what we have also in other sectors, that when things go very wrong, I mean, I can mention forest fires, but often when you see in the crisis in the EU, we have this mechanism, of course, for countries to help each other, but when really needed, it should also be possible to have this additional thing that can come in. And this is basically what we're proposing with the Cybersecurity Reserve. I put down in the bottom, there is, it actually deserves its own presentation, if I could say, because that's all the investment programs we have, the funding we're making available, the capacity building, because with all of these regulations and with our policies, of course, there will be requirements both for the member states, for the companies, for the authorities, business organizations, and so on. So we're very keen on supporting this implementation. So we have made available funding, and I would, as always, encourage everyone to keep an eye out, because we have funding coming through now to support implementation of the Cyber Resilience Act already. We have funding coming out to support people to get ready also for certification. So I would very much encourage everyone here also to have a look at that. And then down in the very little corner to the right, I put the Skills Academy. I don't mean to put it last or put it in the corner, because in a way it is I think, central to everything we do, and it is a conversation that we need to have much more, which is, what do we do in terms of cybersecurity skills? We have an estimated lag of between 300,000 and 500,000 in Europe. We don't really know how many, which I think in itself indicates that we also have an issue. And this is something that we don't just need to talk more about, but we also need to do more about. So what we put forward is this notion of a cybersecurity skills academy, which brings together different training programs, which also helps us understand the market. What are the market needs? How do we put together, make sure that people get upskilled, reskilled, or just skilled in cybersecurity? And it's an area, again, where it's very interesting for us to have as big engagement as possible. So if you are a private company, or if you're from a national authority, we would also very much welcome an engagement in this, because we need to really join efforts on that. Finally, I mentioned already at the very top the fact that we have international cooperation. It's something that is growing a lot, I think, these years. And I would also say that the war in Ukraine has further fueled this. Of course, we are working on our side. We're working with Ukraine. We have a cyber dialogue with Ukraine. We're working very closely with our American friends as well. We are engaging with NATO on cybersecurity, and a number of other like-minded countries where we are also engaging and establishing relations. Now, on this slide is basically showing you everything which is there right now. Maybe a few words also on what's to come, and I would say what are the priorities on my side. I think looking at everything that's in place now, what we've done so far, especially with NIS2, but certainly also with the CRA, is that we're building the frameworks, right? We're really starting to put in place the structures of what will be. So one key thing, and I know it's not very politically sexy to say, but for me, a key thing to work on now is really implementation. To make sure that we fill out this framework and we make the most of what's there, because, you know, I look at NIS2, I see an amazing framework with a great opportunity to really improve cybersecurity in Europe. And I think it's very important that all of us keep the eyes on the ball and say, how do we actually make the most of this? How do we help our companies improve their cybersecurity baselines? How do we help work together in Europe? How do we make sure that the information flows to those it needs to flow to, and not to those it doesn't need to flow to? But also, how do we make sure that we're able to assist each other and really strengthen cyber defense together? So on one hand, I would say this kind of implementation drive is going to be very important in the coming years. For the Cyber Resilience Act and for the product security specifically, we will have a lot of work going ahead on standardization. It is absolutely key to making sure that it's simple to implement the CRA for our businesses. So we need to have good, solid European standards in place. So we're working now on standardization requests. We will work with the European standardizations organizations to have them in place. But for us, a very large part of the work there will be on really creating standardization. We will also do a review of the Cybersecurity Act. So this really means that we will be looking at how does certification work in Europe, how do we make it work better, and we will be engaging in a review on this, and of course also of ENISA, our cybersecurity agency, which is also on the slide, so I should probably have mentioned it, which is of course an absolute key player when it comes to cybersecurity in Europe. Another aspect which I think everyone should be interested in and needs to start getting interested in if they're not is on how artificial intelligence impacts the job we're doing. I'm not saying it necessarily needs to be something that would be regulated from our side or that we need an initiative on, but it's something that on our side we're starting to get very interested in understanding, both in terms of offensive capabilities used against us, but also in terms of enhancing our defense. Of course, the Cyber Shield, so the SOC project, is very much working around the concept of being able to actually use together artificial intelligence to enhance our cyber defense. But I think overall there are many different aspects of artificial intelligence that I would advocate that everyone in this room and beyond would really start to care about. The other part we also need to start thinking about is quantum computing. What does that mean for cryptography? What does that mean for our encryption standards and the requirements we have that you have to, of course, ensure state-of-the-art encryption? So here, work on the standards are ongoing. But I think it's also important to start reflecting on how do we get our critical infrastructure, how do we get everyone ready for when the standards are there? You know, what is the homework we need to do so far? So these are some of the things where, you know, it's not necessarily going to be in my team that we will be doing anything on this, but it's something that I think as a cybersecurity community in Europe that we need to start thinking about. And I think I will stop here and then also hopefully get some questions from the audience or above. Thank you.
Yes, so there are questions indeed coming in from menti.com where you can use this number and then you have to access a nice small window where you can type your question. And there are some questions indeed. So let me I'm not picking one. Let's start with the first one. Could you please comment on the implications that Cyber Resilience Act will have on developers within EU and outside EU offering non-commercial products like language libraries? So is there any implications? How do you see it?
Yeah. So what's very important to say about the Cyber Resilience Act is that it is classic EU product legislation, which means that it only looks at products that are placed on the market, as we say in EU language, which means that it is products that are commercial. It's part of a commercial activity. So that means that, for instance, if you are part of a project that is a non-commercial project, and here I'm thinking, for instance, this is clearly the case for open source. I mean, we see a lot of open source projects like this. Then if it's a non-commercial activity, you would not be covered by the scope of the CRA. If you are part of a commercial activity, of course, then you would have to take this into account. Another thing, actually, also for these kind of non-commercial projects, I think what is interesting as well is that with the CRA, we have this, in our proposal, we put in this due diligence obligation for the integrators, which we hope will also help improve the security of these products because of the non-commercial products of what's being integrated, because that means that if you're a company and you're integrating components like this, you will also need to ensure the security of them. So you will have to also carry out, because overall, of course, we have to have every aspect of the product needs to be checked, but only the commercial ones.
Perfect, thank you. Now, this next one might be related, but you are about to decide if this touches the same issue. What products will be CRA impact? What are the applicability criteria? Or is the Act applied to just anything that is available publicly?
Yeah, so as I said before, the scope of the Cyber Resilience Act is very big. Basically, we're covering any hardware or software which is sold in the EU. Or when I mean sold, it's being placed on the market, as we say. So it's either where the manufacturer will get some money for it, but it can also be part of a wider commercial activity. So all these products will be coming under the scope of the CRA. There are some exemptions. For instance, cars are exempt from it. Why? Because we already have a regulation in place for cars specifically, where there are cybersecurity.
Is that the cars as the hardware, or you mean like the software on board the car?
So everything.
Okay.
Encompassed, because what we have under the car regulation, I call it, it probably has a fancy name, but what we have under the car regulation is we look at, we basically screened all the legislation in the EU, the product legislation, and we looked at where do they already have cybersecurity requirements, which are as good as what we're going to propose. So in order to avoid that some sectors would have double requirements, we said, these sectors are outside the scope because you already have things.
Because there are some safety.
They already have the requirements. We see them in it. But for the vast part of hardware and software, so connectable hardware and software, it would be within the scope of the CRA, as long as it's part of a commercial activity.
Perfect. The questions keep coming in, but I'm a little bit short of time, so I will pick one. Can you mention one example of successful cooperation between EU and NATO in terms of cybersecurity? So have you had any cases you are allowed to speak of?
So I must say I'm relatively new in this position, so I can certainly speak mainly on what we're doing ourselves. I mean, what we have with NATO, and I think it also goes back to our cyber defense policy, it is an area where we're growing closer to each other, and we're cooperating more and more. So it's certainly something that's, let's say, improving in these years. We actually had a very good specific product that came out this summer, which we did with NATO, and I can speak freely about that because it's publicly available on the website, where we carried out a joint assessment. So we had a joint assessment for the 4 big critical sectors that are relevant both to military but also civilian. So basically energy, transport, digital infrastructure and space. Here we engaged with NATO, and we had the discussions and, also try to share the picture of where we see risks and so on. And this is something that has been made publicly available now. But there are so many fields where engaging with NATO just makes sense, because in cyberspace, what is military, what is civilian, critical infrastructure. It's often that our critical infrastructure, as with the 4 sectors, are highly relevant for military purposes as well. So there's just a lot of fields where we can cooperate in still.
Perfect. Christiane, I have to thank you so much for your presentation.
Okay. Thank you.
And a nice little souvenir from the organizers. So there's a mystery box for you. And a very special coin, if you will.
Oh, yes.
Now, coins are popular, so this one is rather big. It's rather hard to steal that one without noticing.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. A nice applause one more time.